At the start of my AS Media course, I had never heard of the name InDesign, so I had absolutely no idea how to use it or even what it was actually used for. This was completely different to Photoshop for me, considering I had used it in my spare time as a hobby, as well as GCSE graphics. From this I knew pretty much exactly what HTool did and what I could do with it. The only thing limiting me, in my opinion, was my creativity with it at the time. By the end of my first year, I believe my skills had developed quite far in terms of InDesign, considering I didn't know what it did before. At this point, I knew what the program was used for and why it was necessary. I used InDesign to professionally lay out my pages with guidelines, bleed areas, master pages and gutter spaces. This helped a lot for my contents page as well as my double page spread. In contrast, I didn't necessarily learn much more about Photoshop since I felt comfortable with it before the course started. A few things I learned that definitely helped me out, however, were the different options I could use in the character section of text. I hadn't actually used this before, but it contributed to increasing workflow and making dull fonts more unique. I also learned how to edit an image on the photography side of things using brightness and contrast as well as saturation levels to make the photo stand out more. Overall, I think I showed more progress in InDesign side of things rather than the Photoshop skills. I felt much more helpful. For the duration of my first year's main task, there were a few problems I came across, so I had to deal with them quickly. One of the main problems was trying to lay out my contents page on software like Photoshop. At the time, I think I took a very naive approach to InDesign, assuming I could do everything I needed in Photoshop. However, starting my contents page, I was hit with the realization that it wasn't the case at all. Layout of text consistently and neatly on Photoshop can prove to be a difficult task since it's simply not what it's made for. Photoshop is essentially a blank canvas for graphical editing, not paragraph typing. So when I tried to do this, different bits of text would appear slightly out of line and make the overall page look unprofessional. Once I imported my graphical images into InDesign, I felt it was much easier to lay out using the guidelines in the gutter. Furthermore, a problem I came across with InDesign was mistakenly thinking I could do a graphical editing with it. Although it was somewhat possible, it's not what the program was made for, and therefore Photoshop saved the situation. I could edit everything that I needed in Photoshop before importing it separately into InDesign to lay the images out. My main task for my second year helped to develop my Photoshop skills significantly, which surprised me considering I thought I knew everything I would need. Rather than taking a plain image and boosting the contrast and some of the saturation, I experimented more with the filter effects like noise and Gaussian blur. Noise was especially useful for me in my front cover since the image quality wasn't great. On its own, I don't think the image would have been usable, however with the noise filter it instantly gave the image a different angle of amateur photography that was very fitting to my magazine. I also experimented a lot with the idea of a glitched out VCR effect. To do this, I would have to use the shear filter as well as marquee, add plus subtract in spaces. These were aspects of Photoshop that I hadn't touched before this year. The marquee, add or subtract also helped me with my masthead to cut a circle in half, essentially just increasing workflow. My second year didn't go so well in terms of InDesign progress. I basically just used it for the exact same reason as last time, except slightly less in places. I only used it for my contents page and everything else was done in Photoshop since I didn't feel it was necessary to do otherwise. I didn't have many pages that were particularly structured since it was a skateboarding magazine. I wanted it to appear messy and cut and paste. My main task took quite a while for me to finish in comparison to my first year that I finished very early. I believe this is because of the amount of freedom I had with the task, being given the choice to do whatever I wanted and defy conventions of normal magazines. I put too much pressure on that factor. This led me to spending way too long on thinking of something that looked unique. I eventually finished my front page, but it looked too much like a poster than the magazine. This was a big wake-up call at the time, which persuaded me to switch back to a more conventional style that had more structure. Once I made this decision, I finished my magazine with a matter of minutes and was much happier with the results. I also learned to make the best out of the images I had. I was very limited in terms of when I could shoot due to the weather and it being a skateboarding magazine, so whenever I could get out taking photos I had to make them count. Sometimes they were rushed so I didn't get the results I wanted, so to combat this I put the contrast extremely high on my prop skate store advert and made it look black and white. I eventually made that into a sniffing glue inspired page and the image fit well with the aesthetic of cut and paste. One of the pros of using Photoshop is that it's extremely intuitive, at least for me. Every tool is pretty easy to get a grasp of due to the images that they have, and they have short descriptions. This helps a lot when you don't quite know what you want to hover over, what you want, but you hover over the burn tool, for example, and find out that it can darken a specific part of an image. Another pro for Photoshop would be how easy it is to make a bad image look with tools like contrast, saturation, and levels. You can make most images work in some sort of way, although it might not always be the way you intended. One of the main cons of Photoshop for me is trying to lay out things like text. When you want a very structured section of a page with paragraph text, it can be difficult trying to align them together and make them look neat, since it's not what the program was made for. Publishing. This brings me to InDesign, and my main pro for that. Being able to structure paragraphs so easily with this program helps a lot when getting the boring part of a page out of the way. You can even use the placeholder text option if you can't think of anything to write at the time. This is amazing for me since I much prefer to spend time on the graphical side of things rather than text. Another pro is being able to add bleed areas and general guidelines really easily too, often not having to calculate the distance from one end of the page like you would have to do with Photoshop. Cons for InDesign would be that it does feel quite clunky to use, in the sense that it isn't intuitive like Photoshop. Having to create a box before you add an image isn't something you would naturally go to do. Because of this, I think InDesign has a learning curve that some people might not have the patience for, like me.